Hello, and welcome to the Fintech Times Presents series of webinars. Established in 2016, the Fintech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading fintech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from the fintech world. Firstly, I'd like to say hello to our online audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. And today we're going to be exploring the idea of Fintech for Good. You can follow along the conversation on Twitter using hashtag Fintech Times Fintech for Good, and you can follow us at the Fintech Times. So fintech exists to solve problems, but while more efficient services and greater banking for all are noble causes, what other ways has fintech been used to do good in the wider community? This webinar will examine how fintech has led the way with bringing solutions to the table, especially during a global pandemic. Innovation over the last 18 months, as well as a long-standing commitment to do good, will be discussed, while also looking ahead to the future and how fintech can shine a light on the underserved and under-prioritized. So we have a great group of people for today's discussion, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Bragi Fjardal, CMO and VP of Business Development at Meniga, Francesca Hodgson, co-founder and managing director at Goodbox, and Duncan Stevens, CEO of Gretel. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start off by having each of you give us a short introduction. So Bragi, why don't you kick us off?
Absolutely. So my name is Bragi Fjardal. I'm CMO at a fintech company called Meniga. So the mission of Meniga is really helping people lead better and more sustainable financial lives. And our solution include a variety of things, including personal finance management tools, cash flow management, toolbox, savings gamification, carbon footprint trackers, and other things. And we are a fintech that partners with banks to bring our solution to consumers. And we have products live with more than 170 financial institutions across around 30 countries. We were founded in Iceland in 2009. And today we are around 150 Menigans, as we call ourselves, across our offices in London, Reykjavik, Stockholm, Warsaw, and Singapore.
Brilliant, fantastic. Francesca, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Polly, and thanks for having us. Yes, I'm Francesca Hodgson, and I'm co-founder of a fintech company called Goodbox. Goodbox has been operating for over 5 years now in the non-profit market. And what Goodbox does is it helps non-profits raise via digital solutions in our ever-increasing cashless society. So to provide some context on that, imagine you're walking into a museum or gallery and you're asked for a donation, or you see the donation pot in front of you, but you search your pockets and you're just not carrying cash anymore. So what Goodbox provides is digital hardware, software and service to allow to the acceptance of digital donations via contactless Apple and Android Pay. We've worked and partnered with over 2,000 UK nonprofits to date, and we've helped raise millions in incremental donations for those organisations.
Brilliant, fantastic. And then Duncan, last but not least.
Hi, Polly. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm Duncan Stevens. I'm the co-founder and CEO of an organisation called Gretel. We're kind of a fintech with a social purpose. We have created a free-to-consumer platform that is simple, completely free to use, and helps some 20 million people in the UK reconnect with lost savings and investments right across the financial services spectrum in a matter of just kind of 3 minutes or so. There's about 20 million people that are impacted, as I said, and there's a staggering kind of 50 billion pounds out there. So interesting to know what we could do to help kind of drive that charitable giving kind of agenda as well.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, yes, thank you all three of you again for joining me today. I'd love to kick off by asking each of you, so what were some of the big problems that emerged in the initial lockdown in 2020? I know I'm sure we're all sick of talking about COVID by now, but I just love to know what were some of the problems that really sort of happened in initial lockdown. Bragi, why don't we go for you first?
Sure. I mean, I think you know, obviously with the pandemic, I think the biggest initial theme for everyone was just uncertainty. I mean, whether you think about the situation that we all faced, you know, from the viewpoint of individuals or companies, you know, we really had no idea what was going to happen and you know, how everyone else was going to react. And I think you had a lot of companies like ours and others that were just facing existential threat, people facing losing their jobs. But in some ways, you know, these were sort of temporary problems in a sense. We didn't know how long they were going to last, but, you know, and with them, you have kind of problems and you have opportunities. And for us, I think apart from dealing with this uncertainty as a business, the most important thing for us was figuring out, what would the new norm look like? I mean, what would change permanently as a result of COVID? And I think what we have felt in that respect, and what I would like to highlight, is just a massive change in people's concern with common existential threats, and maybe more of a willingness to actually be part of the solution. And I'm not just talking about really, the pandemic, but like things like global poverty, climate change, and things like that. And I think in many ways, to us, the biggest theme emerging from COVID is exactly this, right? Like, how do we as fintech, become a part of the solution? How do we help address, that fundamental opportunity in the market, that people have this changed attitude? And I think, in our opinion, I think fintech can have such a big role to play in sort of facilitating a movement of people that not only want to kind of, do charitable things, but maybe change the way that they consume or behave or make life choices based on the impact of those choices on a lot of different things. And that has kind of changed in part, like Meniga has changed in part as a company. We've sort of, we've brought a new product to market, and we've changed a lot of our focus because we believe there is a big opportunity there.
Yeah, absolutely. Duncan, I saw you nodding along to a lot of what Bragi was saying there. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I think for us, it's probably a slightly different lens, maybe, but just simply because for us, we don't have the benefit of having been around for a number of years and the stability that comes with that. We started our business. In fact, I left my former employment about 2 months before COVID hit. So we were very, very early stages. And for us, I think the biggest challenge that we had was just one of communication. We had loads of really great conversations going on from a sales perspective that, for very understandable reasons, when you're talking to banks, insurers, wealth managers, just suddenly stopped. These organizations had their own existential threats. They were forced to, I guess, kind of address that disaster recovery question that nobody had ever thought of, which is, what if no one in your employment could ever go into the office again? Mm-hmm. That's a really challenging one. Plus, kind of, how do they service their customers? And from that perspective, communication was key, but it was also something that was in fairly short supply between us as a new fintech and those large organizations. However, I think the great thing that we've seen come out of it is, like Bragi was saying, it's that cultural change, that willingness on the part of those organizations, and also on the part of the consumer to want to do things differently, to want to be more responsible. And from our very own kind of niche perspective, I guess, we've looked at it and said there were months and months where government, financial organizations were looking at how they could support people who were being furloughed, how they could support businesses with CBILS loans and things like that. And we sat there quite simply banging the drum saying, there's £50 billion there that already belongs to people, which wouldn't involve them getting indebted if you could simply connect into us. So that was a catalyst for a lot of great conversations, albeit probably 3 or 4 months later than we would have liked them to have been, just because there was that initial kind of knee-jerk reaction of kind of disaster recovery.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, Francesca, I want to come to you because I'm sure you've got some incredibly interesting insights about what Goodbox have been doing with charities. So what were some of the big problems that you saw that emerged in the initial lockdown?
Well, I'd like to build on kind of the theme of challenges and opportunity, because I think that's an important one. And what we've really appreciated throughout all of this time is that human connection and those human elements, and how really we look at businesses as businesses, but really businesses are just people. They're just a whole lot of people working together to solve a common problem. And so I feel like throughout that pandemic, whilst it's been incredibly tough, whilst there's been so many challenges, for Goodbox, for example, 90% of our client base are visitor attraction centres, community centres, areas where people come together and congregate. All of this just wasn't possible. So, we're very grateful for the government support, things like the furlough scheme that came in that allowed us as a business to stay together to address these challenges throughout that time. if we kind of look at the glass half full situation for Goodbox, what it did was it would increase the acceleration and adoption of digital products and platforms as people became increasingly cashless. Things like hygiene factors then came into the equation, as well as kind of convenience. So for us now coming through, and hopefully fingers crossed that emerging on the other side, what I'm really kind of proud of as an organization and, you know, as a wider community is how much support has been given to individuals, to businesses, and amongst the greater community, which includes charitable organisations. Of course, I'm passionate about charity, and charity underpins so much of our society. Every organisation may have a charitable arm, whether it's schools, hospices, you know, hospitals, you name it. These organisations are underpinned by charity and volunteership and people that give up their time and their energy to support these amazing organisations that pick up where they're fundamentally under-resourced, society is under-resourced. So I think what's been really nice about these challenges is that sense of community and coming together and really valuing what we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you just said there. I think definitely the idea of community is just completely increased entirely over this situation. It's been really great to see how people come together and, you know, start solving these problems together. So obviously, speaking of these challenges then, fintech has obviously really thrived over the past 18 months to help sort of bring solutions to the problems that we've seen. So in your three's opinion, how did fintechs rise to these challenges of solving these concerns? Perhaps Duncan, if we go to you first.
I think, you know, you've really seen, you know, the established fintechs, you know, like my colleagues on the call here, who have really matured into the kind of scenario and kind of adapted and grown their businesses to meet that kind of supply and demand need. But you've also seen an explosion of new fintechs and fintechs that make us look old. You know, at kind of 18 months old, you've seen people who have lost their jobs doing things that they would never have dreamt of doing before and actually striking out on their own. And I think that's really exciting to see. And equally, the number of financial institutions that have got behind the FinTech Pledge and are now actively seeking out conversations with those new starts to be able to explore things that they couldn't possibly dream of, you know, developing on their own in the space of time in which they want to do it. Mm-hmm. It's that agility which I think has been the real cornerstone of the success of fintech over the last kind of 12 months or so.
Yeah, fantastic. And then Francesca, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think Duncan articulated it really well, and I think there's lots of opportunity and individuals that are now passionate about solving the problems, to build on some of my earlier comments. And so certainly we are seeing an emergence of new and exciting organisations that really break the barriers down from traditional incumbents and can act in a more agile way to provide solutions to the market. We're also seeing some really exciting emerging technologies such as open banking that can really help these young organisations avail of that technology to provide innovative solutions that help address traditional, I guess, problems in the sector or ways in which the sector doesn't necessarily reach all consumers that it possibly could. So it's certainly a really exciting time, and I look forward to seeing what's emerging over the next 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Braggy, anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, to me, it's you know, for me, sort of financial services and fintechs kind of exists to, in many ways, to kind of, you know, facilitate other things and help scale up things, you know, that sort of, you know, scale up needs, you know, that kind of emerge in the market. And I think, like I was mentioning before, I think COVID has actually changed a number of things. And if I can mention sort of a specific example where I've seen fintech really kind of, you know, run relatively fast and provide different types of solution. And if I go then back to sort of what I was saying before about people's sort of increased willingness to, you know, or increased concern with existential threats and willingness to do something about it. And if I specifically, you know, look at climate change, you know, which is one of those, I think, existential threats that has received a lot of focus as a result of COVID now. And what we've seen in different, you know, just if you look at different surveys, you can sort of see that there is like this kind of emerging brewing, community of carbon conscious consumers, people that are really, wanting to understand the impact they have on the environment and really do something about it. But there's really a gap in the market because, if you're thinking about yourself and the environment, it's difficult to find a way to understand, like, what's my impact, what's my carbon footprint, and then once you understand that, how can you do something about it, in a relatively intuitive way. And banks or existing financial institutions that have your transactions are really in a very good position to serve this need. I mean, you can estimate your carbon footprint based on your transactions. You can enable people to offset by supporting projects around the world that need financing to get the projects off the chart through carbon offsetting solutions. And just in the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a lot of new fintechs popping up around carbon accounting, around setting up exchanges for carbon offsetting. I mean, Meniga has been part of the solution, so we sort of diverted our attention a little bit, and we developed a carbon calculator and a carbon sort of insight solution that helps people kind of change their behavior and consume more sustainably. And there are many different examples just around this space, around this sort of crossover between fintech and sustainability tech that I think is quite exciting. But sort of if I back out, I just think more broadly, I think it's important for the fintech communities to sort of understand the broader context of where companies are moving, where consumers are moving, and then figure out very quickly how can the fintech community help facilitate those movements. And to me, the carbon conscious consumer movement is super exciting, but it's a movement that needs legs, and I think fintech has a role to play in enabling that movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really want to sort of carry on this thought here and sort of obviously ask the big question for the day, I guess, in that how can fintech be used for good? You've all touched on it already in the conversations that we've had currently, but yeah, how can fintech be used to good? And I know that's a huge question, but Francesca, I'd love to start with you and get your insights on that.
Thank you. And I think it's about reaching consumers in an ethical way. So, we've talked about a little bit before around how there's so much drive from the consumer to want to live an ethical life, to be considerate around things like, carbon, environmental impact. That is really a key touch point and a key decision-making factor when it comes to consumers today. They do care. They want to know that when they are spending money or when they're investing, that actually there is some greater societal impact and good. And so because of the range of technologies that's available, because of the new emergence on the market of these creative companies with these ethical focuses and these ethical drives, that's where you're going to get this Fintech for Good category coming in, because good is a broad topic. What is good? Good means different things to different people, but there are so many different people out there creating their own version of good that it's really exciting to see that there are lots of angles now whereby we can operate successful businesses which provide valuable solutions to individuals, but also they are supporting their wider communities through the work that they're doing as well, whether that be enabling or whether that be giving back. So certainly for me, it's the exciting part about good comes from the fact that companies now, it's so important that corporate social responsibility strategy is such an integral part of any brand, because consumers almost demand and expect it, that it forces companies into a position to really consider what are they doing, why are they doing it, and what's the value impact for wider societies in which they operate.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you've said then. I think it's really interesting what you're saying there about the consumer and how that's driving quite a lot of things, which is a brilliant thing, because like you say, it's forcing businesses to actually look at what it is they're doing. So Bragi, I'd love to get your insights on this. How can fintech be used for good?
I think that there are so many different ways fintech can be used for good. And I think over time, fintech has also already kind of been used for good, whether, if you think about, access to finance, where that is difficult, creating microfinance financing solutions, helping people save through gamified solutions, and many different, there are many different ways I think fintech has already played a role in making the world a better place. But And I think it's a combination of facilitating charitable solution and maybe driving business in a better direction, because in some ways I think the most impactful way of driving good in fintech is to find where fintech for good is also good for business. And I think that comes a lot back to what Francesca was saying, about the consumer drive, because there's so much drive from consumers, for businesses to be ethical. It's become good for business to find, good paths. But I feel that, where I get most excited is where companies are really starting to kind of innovate in their own product portfolio and finding, ethical products or things that facilitate ethical products, like we're now seeing, for example, in the sort of crossover between fintech and sustainability tech.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic. And then Duncan, your thoughts?
So I think we were at a point maybe a year or two ago where I think the view on traditional financial services and actually not just on financial services, on kind of wider corporate life was actually just a sense of ESG fatigue. That sense that it's become the hip thing to be kind of ESG conscious, and everyone has an ESG agenda. And I remember being at events where you'd have people stand up and say, we're going to create a purpose for this business, because businesses that have purpose and a social conscience get bigger valuations. And there's an awful lot of that going around. And I think where I see fintech having that potential to do a lot of good is actually we're now the ones forcing that agenda. Mm-hmm. So we're actually forcing a genuine agenda of ESG. And I think for me, the other way in which I can see kind of fintechs doing real good is, there's a plethora of organizations kind of springing up every week that are doing new and innovative and great things. But the real good, I think, comes from the fact that, in my experience at least, fintechs are already happy to collaborate and work together. They want to share ideas. They want to tackle bigger issues by collaborating. There's much less of that competitive fear than you get in that kind of traditional, certainly in that kind of traditional financial services world. You've got businesses that would say, actually, Francesca, look, really happily to have a conversation with you and work out how we might partner. It's that kind of thing that I think where it's the power of the consumer picking those products and driving the agenda, and then the power of those organizations just say, there's a bigger agenda here than just us, and we can be part of that solution. We don't have to be all of that solution.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And then I'd like to sort of touch very briefly on underserved communities and sort of underbanked people, and kind of what opportunities does fintech offer to those certain sets of people. Bragi, I don't know if you want to share any thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the areas where fintech has yet to live up to its potential, and I think part of the problem is that I spent half of my time these days in one of the poorest countries in the world, because my wife works in Malawi in sub-Saharan Africa, so I see it every day. And I think fintech has really sort of risen in the western part of the world, where we're used to transactions and working in a traditional banking system, but where poverty exists, banking systems hardly exist, and people they bank in different ways. And access to efficient access to finance is such a fundamental thing, when it comes to trying to kind of carve yourself out of poverty. But there are also just so many other problems that surround finances, that make things difficult in life. For example, in Malawi, where I spend a lot of my time now, it's like 80% of people don't have access to electricity. And electricity is such a fundamental driver of economics and education and just welfare in general. So going sort of back to sort of this opportunity we now have with people that are concerned with climate change is that for example if banks really tried to facilitate people's ability to offset their carbon footprints by allowing them to support projects where people are trying to build renewable energy in sub-Saharan Africa, where you need that extra 20% of financing just to get going. If only 20% of people did that, we would have created a massive movement. And to me, that's just an example for, how fintech, in the Western part of the world can help solve problems in the maybe sort of, a less affluent part of the world. But I think this is probably an area where fintech has yet to make as much of an impact as it could.
Yeah, absolutely. Duncan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think for us, there's a problem closer to home. And I think one of the things that has held back adoptions of things like open banking and open finance actually is the fact that there's a huge array of solutions out there that are really, there's a really solid business case from a consumer perspective, but then perhaps lacking a bit of that kind of win for, what's in it for the financial institution, what's in it for the bank. And I think that's one of the things that holds the banks back from adopting those technologies. And I think that in turn then holds back the adoption of open banking, particularly if you see the disconnect between the proportion of people that use online banking and those that have adopted open banking. There's a huge disconnect there. There's something's getting missed in that value proposition on both sides. And I think from where we are with Gretel, so for me, the underserved communities fall into two categories. It's elderly people and it's very young people. And there's a whole load of, for us, the people who've lost touch with their investments sit right across all kind of demographics, but the ones that are particularly difficult for financial institutions to serve and for fintechs actually to serve has been old people who don't typically adopt tech and young people who are very tech savvy but don't have the right kind of identity credentials perhaps to be able to adopt that technology because there are barriers placed in their way. And that's kind of where we've focused our efforts. So myself and my co-founders always use our parents as the reference point. So for me, I kind of go, well, my dad turns 90 in a month. And I go, well, if he can use it, anyone should be able to use it. And we've created our entire user journey around being able to make it work for him, because if it can work for him, it can work for literally anybody. And that's kind of where we've tried to come from that. And whether it's people at one end of the economic spectrum who are on benefits, who we can help benefit, or it's someone who is sitting on an investment that they had no idea that they'd inherited that's worth enough to pay off a mortgage. Who knows? They're all communities which in some way, shape or form are being underserved.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting how when you say like underserved communities, you almost automatically think, less developed countries very far away, but actually it's a problem, within the UK, within what we have here. So I always think it's very interesting that it is, so close to home. And then Fran, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's a really important topic. It's a really interesting conversation that we're having. So the problem is largely systemic as well, as we work in highly regulated environments when we're working with financial technology. So that ID verification piece, that critical component sometimes in a B2C solution, if we look at homelessness, for example, when people don't have residential addresses, you can't verify that individual. They have no identity. So when it comes to providing banking solutions for them, it's just impossible. The regulatory landscape doesn't allow it at present. And we had this problem, or certainly one of my board advisors had this problem, and he set up this project recently called the Horatio Project. He wanted to issue bank cards to everybody on London streets so that people could donate to that individual, so that they would have a card so they could go and spend in shops, just like most consumers would do now with contactless transactions on the rise. But that wasn't possible because we couldn't get the acquiring banks to verify those individuals. So the way in which he's got around it today is to create a ledger system so that each individual can be signed up to a ledger which is held, and then the money can be spent in certain locations that are part of the network and part of the system, whether it be overnight stays in hostels or whether it be some local shops that are accepting the cards through that scheme. But and that may be one solution that we can take as a first step in addressing the underserved market. But certainly because of the financial regulation that all businesses operating in the fintech and financial services space face, there are some real key challenges that do still need to be addressed. But again, it's really great that we can have this conversation so that we can promote this awareness of these issues that we have in society, because to some extent, technology can also provide greater divides between kind of poverty and well-off landscape, as there are services that are available to some and not to all, and that doesn't go to helping promote inclusion in any way, shape or form. So it's something that we all need to be really, really aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you've said there, and I definitely think awareness is almost half the battle with like situations like this, and making people aware of what is actually happening. But no, fantastic. So I'd love to sort of turn the spotlight now on three of you and your companies. And I'd love to know if there are any, recent innovations that you've made over the last couple of years that you'd like to champion in this sort of area. So Francesca, I'll start with you. Are there any innovations you'd love to champion today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just want to champion our main products. So we took quite a hard route as an early stage startup, developing both hardware and software. So whilst our box is currently designed in the UK, it's manufactured in Shenzhen, although we are looking at ways in which we can onshore that now. But this box that we produced, a lot of times you get the question to go, well, payment readers have been everywhere. Like, why is it so special? What is it so good about Goodbox that allows nonprofits to use these devices? And fundamentally, when it comes to nonprofit giving, when it comes to fundraising, there is an engagement piece there that's so critical towards garnering that engagement and allowing locations to understand, or consumers or donors to understand, where it is that they'll be able to help if they were to donate. And one of the conversations I had very early on in my journey was with the Costa Foundation, and I'm sure many people have been into Costa Coffee and seen maybe a cup of loose change on the side. What is that for? Where is it going, and what does it mean? Well, I didn't know actually at the time, but the Costa Coffee Group have built 71 schools and coffee growing communities around the world and fundamentally changed education. That's incredible. That's amazing. But it's very rare that you kind of get that engagement when you're in those point of sale environments. So through our terminals, we put a great lot of effort into creating screens to provide content that could connect with individuals. We also offer devices so that they can stand alone, so they don't have to be tethered to tablets, smartphones. They stand alone and they can do their job without the prompting from a volunteer. And they're always ready to accept donations in an easy and effortless way. So the whole end-to-end infrastructure on which Goodbox is built is it's a payments platform, it's a payment company, and we deal with everything from the issuing of the hardware through to the ID verification of the clients that we work with, and the remittance and settlements, and extracting data for our clients so they can better understand their fundraising and the success of their fundraising and their reach. So actually, I really do want to just champion what Goodbox has been able to do in the market, because 50% still today of charitable fundraising is reliant on small cash micro donations in order to get that community support. So if we take cash out the equation, and if you just look at the statistics, you can see how cash is in decline whilst the debit cards is continually on the rise. If you remove cash from that equation, it really puts these organizations that are so vital to our community at a significant disadvantage. So I'm really proud of what Goodbox has been able to do, the millions that we've been able to raise, and the organisations that we've been able to support through our network. So I certainly want to support and champion Goodbox as an end-to-end provider. So thank you for the opportunity, Polly.
Perfect. No, it's amazing to hear the things that you've been doing. Absolutely. Duncan, what would you like to champion today?
So my first thought when you asked the question was kind of other than my own business. I think what both of the guys here are doing from an environmental perspective and from a charitable giving perspective are absolutely incredible and very laudable. And I would be honoured to work with either of them in any way moving forwards if I could, to help champion what they're doing. But like Francesca, I'm really passionate about what we do. We have created something which is completely revolutionary that nobody else is doing at the moment. We've overcome enormous kind of hurdles that existed in the kind of identity and verification space to be able to help those customers who wouldn't otherwise be able to help themselves, to create accessibility for some of the kind of the estimated 27 million vulnerable customers living in the UK today. And I think, as much as I think, from a technology perspective and the problems we'll be able to solve for financial institutions and for consumers, really for me, it comes down to changing people's lives. It'll be the person who is getting kind of red reminder bills because they've lost their job, they're about to lose their house, and suddenly we help them find £5,000, say, and they can get it quickly and easily for free without having to pay those kind of commission fees that everyone else would charge. That allows them to pay off those bills and live without that threat over their head. For me, it's that kind of thing. There's a million people out, a million children out there who don't even know that they've got a child trust fund product, and a lot of these people are coming out of the care system. And I just think, it might just be a few £100s, but what a great start in life, given that it's come from the government anyway, to help these people take that first step into adulthood. So I'm like Francesca, I'm equally passionate about what we're doing, but I'm also very passionate about what we can do collaboratively.
Yeah, fantastic. Again, it's great to hear the things that you're doing and the actual difference that it can make. And then Braggy, what would you like to champion with us today?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo what Duncan said. I feel kind of inspired by both of the solutions that have been mentioned here, and just I just see a lot of exciting innovation in the market today. That's partially, I think, being fueled by all the changes we've seen as a result of COVID. But I mean, from Monica's perspective, I'd like to champion our Carbon Insight product, which is a product that allows you to basically instantly estimate your carbon footprint based on your spending data and monitor it real time. But also, it's a product that inspires you to really understand what your footprint means, put it into context with everything that happens around you. How many trees would it take to absorb your footprint in a year? How far could you drive in a car on your footprint? So that you understand what it really is, but also to understand what you can do about it. Where does your footprint come from? How can you, in a relatively simple way, reduce your footprint and save money at the same time, and things like that, all the way to helping people then, do something about, the footprint once you've gotten it to a point where you can't really reduce it anymore. And I think that's where I get really excited, because we, like a number of other fintechs, in the market, are trying to find ways to make it, easier for people to offset their carbon footprint. And I think, one of the ways that I think that's going to be exciting is if we can create a connection between you offsetting your carbon footprint and then the project that you're supporting, which is sort of like, it's a charitable cause, but you're putting it into the context of making amends for the things that, you leave behind as you live as a person. And we work with banks to do this. And what it is for us the fastest way to make impact, because that's where people have their finances. And I would love to have conversations with banks about, why this is a good idea for banks to do, how this makes, how this is good for our community, how it is good for the environment, but also how it can be good for business if you do it in the right way.
Yeah, fantastic, brilliant. And what I love is that we've had three very different examples there of you championing, your for good fintechs, and just how, and it's pure example of how wide ranging the idea of fintech for good is. And that's why I really love talking about this topic, because there's just so much the idea of what is good, I think. And it's great to hear from each of you about what you've been doing. So we are running out of time, but I do want to ask you one more question. I want to look ahead a little bit to the future and sort of ask you, where will this attitude of fintech for good take us? Where do you think we're going to go? So Duncan, I'm going to go to you first. Where do you think it's going to go?
I think there's going to be a paradigm shift, if I'm honest, over the next, certainly over the next kind of 10, 15 years or so. I mean, we're going to take a generational leap, really, aren't we? The new generation coming through are far more aware and conscious of things like charity, like social giving, like the environment, So whether the older generation, whether my generation really care enough or not, it's going to happen. And I think enough people are behind it that actually, Fintech for Good is a thing that's here to stay well and truly.
Yeah, fantastic. Braggy, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, no, I agree with Duncan. I really hope you're right, Duncan. And I have a feeling that there is a movement afoot. I just, I have my 14-year-old daughter lecturing me on how I'm consuming stuff. Telling me off for not recycling properly. And just yesterday I said, look, the minute I stop having to throw away your food, you can start lecturing me on the environment. And I think those are nice types of conversations to have around the table. And I agree. I think there, if I sort of look at the younger generations, I think if there's one thing that I feel that they gotten right is that in many ways maybe they're a little bit more value based than at least my generation was when I was growing up. So I'm hopeful.
Perfect. And then Francesca, to round us off.
Exactly the same as Duncan and Braggy here. Like, I just hope there's a greater awareness around consumption and more localized productions of products and services as well. So more around the quality over quantity, and ensuring that we are looking and keeping, domestic products to localized environments and really supporting the way in which we work. And hopefully, slightly selfishly, I hope I'll be really well looked after in my old age, because there'll be all this innovation to help me.
Brilliant, absolutely. Well, unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of our webinar today. Just want to say thank you so much for our online audience for watching. Don't forget, you can follow along the conversation with hashtag Fintech Times Fintech for Good, and you can follow us at Fintech Times on Twitter. And thank you so much to my panelists, Braggy, Duncan, Francesca. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have absolutely loved our conversation. I think we've really hit some really key points here. So it's been fantastic to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Polly.
You're welcome. Thank you, Polly.
Yeah.
Pleasure. Thank you.